Yeah.
Okay, right. Well, according to my clock, it's now 5 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time and 6 o'clock Central European Time. So I think it's time to begin this SHAC seminar, continuing our series of online seminars that we started during the pandemic and will certainly continue for the foreseeable future. So could I ask everybody, apart from Pete, to mute themselves, please. People talk for about sort of 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes of moderated discussion. For Zoom, but people who are on Zoom, this can be done directly. Say you want to ask a question in the message box, and I'll call you in order. If you're on YouTube, also put it in the chat box, but that will then be needed to be passed to me, and you won't be able to ask the questions directly on YouTube. Just one of the sort of quirks we've got of broadcasting on two platforms simultaneously.
Right.
So
do you want? Sorry, Miss. Do you want those passed you as they occur, or at the end?
At the end, anytime.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not the only
Okay.
Okay.
So this month, I'm very pleased to welcome Peter Forshaw, who is Associate Professor of the History of Western Esotericism in the Early Modern Period at the University of Amsterdam Centre for the History of Hermetic Philosophy. He specializes in the intellectual and cultural history of occult philosophy, in particular Alchemy, Magic and Christian Cabala, and its relations to religion, science and medicine. He's edited a large number of texts and journals, and will shortly be sending in his 2-volume monograph entitled The Images Heinrich Khunrath in his Oratory and Laboratory, which will be published by Brill next year. And presumably the title of the seminar, not Lazy Heinrich Khunrath in his laboratory, is being drawn from those 2 volumes, but you only got 20 to 30 minutes, Pete. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and hello everyone. A pleasure to see you, even though many of you are incognito in little black postage stamps, as it were. I'm going to share screen and show you my PowerPoint presentation because it's far more attractive than my face. Okay, full screen. Can someone reassure me that they can see this? Is that visible? Yeah, thanks, Frank. Okay, so I'll begin. The not so lazy Heinrich Khunrath in his laboratory. There he is on the left, in his oratory with the laboratory behind him. Sorry, what was that? I think someone needs to switch off their mic, maybe. Okay, so let's begin. Kunrath was from a family of merchants. Okay, Kunrath was from a family of merchants. His father, Sebastian Kunrath, was in the lucrative vitriol trade, so, you know, supplying material for laboratories. Harry graduated with highest honors from Basel Medical Academy in 1588, and here we have him portrayed in a lovely 17th century hand-colored copy of his face with his little dog from the Amphitheater of Eternal Wisdom. Okay, he graduated from Basel with signatures, a thesis on the signatures of natural things. And at the time, this was quite unusual because it was defense of the Paracelsian idea that every object revealed its inner nature through its appearance. And at Basel, this was not a common thing to do at the time. Most people defended far more Galenic types of medical theory. So he's an originator. Now, when I first started reading about alchemy, I was reading quite a lot of John Reed, professor of chemistry at the University of St. Andrews. Probably most of you know his rather Whiggish Through Alchemy to Chemistry. And also this, I love the cover of this book, John Reed's Prelude to Chemistry, where he engages with Kunrath. But I have to say, the older I get, the more irritated I get. The Amphitheatrum sapientiae aeternae of Kunrath is the most remarkable work of this devotee of Theosophy and the wider occultism. His alchemy is spiritual rather than material. Well, historiography has changed, and I would say that Kunrath definitely has a spiritual component. He is a lover of theosophy, but to just sort of dismiss his alchemy as spiritual is annoying. This got even worse in Through Alchemy to Chemistry, published a decade or two later. He is a Hermetic mystic of the deepest dye, whose unbalanced writings consist largely of a fevered sequence of mystical pronouncements and adjurations, and had no influence upon the progress of alchemy towards chemistry. I tend to differ. Much as I enjoyed reading these books, it was clear that Reed had really literally looked at a few of Kunrath's engravings, had probably read a few of the occult aficionados of Kunrath, and decided that he wasn't worth studying. But if he had spent a bit of time and looked at a few of Kunrath's works, he'd have discovered On Primaterial Chaos on the left. This is a work of laboratory alchemy. It's engaged in the ideas of transmutation, theories of matter, chrysopoia, if you like, and it gives you lots of laboratory experience. It gives you a great deal of warning, both about self-deception and fraudulent practices, choosing the wrong matter, for example, or using the wrong processes, and the fact that you should really be aware of things like a saying. You know, you look at something that's shiny in your flask, but you don't immediately assume that it's gold. You have to go and test it. The second title page about the Ethanol, concerning the philosophical Ethanol. This is republished several times, successful, and it's about his own technology, his invention of a new kind of ethanol or alchemical furnace. Hardly spiritual. I mean, it's very material. The next one, 3 highly useful questions, is about Tartarian ailments. Now, Paracelsus had written about tartar, saying that, for example, it was the cause of kidney stones and other stones in the human body. And again, it's a different type of alchemy, this is. It's not gold making or transmutational. It's chemiatria or spagyric medicine. Kunrath is, after all, a physician. So he's engaged in 2 of the major approaches to alchemy, transmutational theory, but also Paracelsian spagyric medicine for healing the human body, using poisons in microscopic doses, in a homeopathic way, to try and cure people, but also is quite ironic. He's using Galenic practices as well. And then on the right-hand side of that, the final book I'm going to introduce you to briefly is Of the Secret, External and Visible Fire of the Mages and Sages. And this is published by the Zetzner family, who famous for publishing lots of alchemical works. And it really is an investigation of different types of fire. So not just fires from coal or from oil, but fires from sunlight, through magnifying glasses or water lenses, even discussions of catching fire from lightning and other sources as well. It's so impressed the encyclopedist Johann Heinrich Alsted that he recommends anyone interested in fire to go and read Kunrath about his finely nuanced idea about what, after all, is one of the main tools of the alchemist or the chemist: fire, heat. So I'm giving a rather down-to-earth, at the moment, representation of Kunrath. Just to sort of further that, Oliver Humberg very kindly sent me a few days ago this. It's a patent application requesting an imperial privilege for an extraction technique to keep the precious metal content of gold and silver ores high. I still actually, to be honest, have to decipher what this is all about. But again, it's a very down-to-earth Kunrath. He graduated in 1588 from medical school. He's setting himself up as both an alchemist, a physico-chemist, and a physician, and is applying for very down-to-earth patents. Okay, and after saying all that, let's go a bit spacey. His first major publication, I can see Mike Zuber grinning at that, 1595 in Hamburg. This book, The Amphitheater of Eternal Wisdom, was first published. Only 5 copies exist, and it must have been horrendously expensive. It has 4 large, and I mean large, circular engravings called Theosophical figures, and labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to take you through them quickly and not dwell on them too much. The first figure, he's very devout. The first figure you should deal with is God. And here we have his sigillum Dei, his seal of God, with Christ at the center. He's most definitely Christian, but it's surrounded by Hebrew. And these are Hebrew divine names. They are the emanations of the deity, the Sephirot of the tree of life. And on the outer ring, it's the Ten Commandments in Hebrew. That's enough of that, but this is his Christian Cabala, okay? And the aim is to recognize God and Christ through Christian Kabbalist prayer in the oratory, okay? The next engraving, if you move in from the divine, you move to the human being and the creation of Adam androgyne. If you look carefully in the center, this is Adam and Eve before they are separated. So it's before the fall, before they've had their apple and their picnic. And it's interesting because this is many different things. It's grades of cognition from Aristotle in the, this inner whiter circle, a ladder of conjunction and union with God in the yellow circle, and various other things. What is interesting for those who are intrigued by the idea of spiritual alchemy, this is a diagram described as know thyself, the microcosm, the little world, through divine magic. Saying that, though, if we look at this square in which Adam is confined, it's surrounded by the four elements: earth at the bottom, on the right-hand side water, then air, and at the top fire. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but this is how it begins. Resolve Adam, the microcosm, the little world, the androgyne, by grinding with the fiery pestle of the Ten Commandments, which we've just seen in the previous engraving, into a powdery mass, growing green with the fertile salt of conversion. And Kunrath proceeds through the four elements with alchemical language. And okay, I'm maybe a bit of a wimp. I think of this as more alchemical spirituality than spiritual alchemy, but that's because I sit on but nevertheless, it's very interesting. It's one of the more explicit combinations of alchemy and religion or spiritual purgation. Then we get to the greater world. If we've gone from the super celestial God to the human beings, now we have the macrocosm, the world. This is not at all spiritual. This is really Kunrath showing his laboratory credentials. I can hear someone in the background, which is a bit distracting. If that can be switched off. Okay, not louder, a bit quieter. Okay. I'll try and continue over this. Figure 3 then. The alchemical rabies is...
Peter, I'm sorry, I've muted you.
Thanks. Right. Sorry, I was rather distracted by that noise. Okay, so what have we got? Moving through, we've got to understand the greater world in the alchemical laboratory. And I'm not going to go through this slavishly, but we've got the hermaphrodite that we find from the 15th century in alchemical imagery. Sun, sulfur, gold, the masculine elements on the left, moon, Mercury is silver, the feminine on the right. This is the rabis or toothing. And if we look carefully at it, it's got various messages. This liquid gushing out in mirror writing on the left says pure blood of the lion facing the east, gluten or glue of the eagle facing the west. Now, anyone who's an obsessive reader of Paracelsus will know this is from the tincture of the natural philosophers. Take only the rose-colored blood from the lion and the gluten from the eagle, which must then be coagulated to create the tincture. And that's the substance that colors metals, for example, but also tinges bodies as well. We've got the 3 glyphs for sulfur, salt, and mercury. So we know that we're in Paracelsian territory, not just the sulfur and mercury of medieval alchemy, but salt as well. For if you don't like it as the 3 substances, at least the 3 modalities of matter. And then, okay, the glyphs. And then what they are holding, or this rabis, this hermaphrodite is holding, is the stone or an egg, really, with descriptions of its various stages of preparation. But again, that also has body, spirit, and soul. It has mercury, sulfur, and salt, as its parent does as well. Above this, we have the bird of Hermes. You sometimes counter in alchemical texts. It's a composite bird: raven, swan, peacock, eagle, phoenix. The raven obviously is the nigredo stage, the calcination of putrefaction, and so on and so forth. There we are, just in case you wondered. There we are, Fawkes, the phoenix from Harry Potter, for those of you who or as childish as I am. Okay, but it's interesting. Kunrath is nothing when he's not compounding things and bringing things together. This can be hybrids like Cabala and alchemy, magic and alchemy, or when he's bringing together different philosophical systems. But if we look on the belly of the bird, we have the word azot. Now, I'm sure you all know it's from al-zawq in Arabic, meaning mercury, but Basil Valentine, whose work I've put above here, says it's from the first and last letters of the three biblical scriptural languages. So the beginning and the end, the alpha and the omega, or primal matter and ultimate matter. And the word Azoth, as most of you will know as well, appears on many engravings of Paracelsus on the pommel of his sword, where supposedly the substance is concealed inside. I like this engraving because it brings in the magical and the Kabbalistic combinations that you also find in Kunrath. Okay, if we look at the word Azoth, though, we find that there is a glyph instead of the letter O. Now, some people who've copied Kunrath's engravings just have it as mercury or quicksilver, which makes sense. It's perfectly legit. The late Joachim Teller was convinced it was mercury. I have to say I'm a bit of a contrarian. Kunrath met John Dee the year after he graduated as a physician, when Kunrath did. And I think personally that it's the hieroglyphic monad of Dee, which is, okay, on some levels it's mercury, quicksilver, but actually it's all of the 7 planets. What I call electrum magicum in Paracelsian terms, a combination of all the planets and all the metals. So you've got a composite bird, a composite word, and a composite glyph. And this is very much in the spirit of alchemy, of Kunrath's kind of practice. Okay, now his best known image. This turns up in so many references to laboratories. Even though, ironically, Kunrath can be discussed and dismissed as a mystic, nevertheless, this turns up as an engraving, an illustration of the laboratory, though not much is said about it. But it's his 4th circular figure. The first 3 I showed you are 2-dimensional. This one is deeply 3-dimensional. And I think the implication is that only when you combine the 3 images do you get the full reality of his praxis in the Oratorium-Laboratorium. And I'm not going to focus on the oratory today. It's a shack event, so more at the laboratory. But his much repeated phrase, ora et labora, pray and work. Some people say this is Benedictine, but actually it's before the Benedictines adopted it. On the circumference of Kunrath's engraving, you find this very interesting threefold use of the Philosopher's Stone, which is very unusual. It really is. You find Elias Ashmole discussing various Philosopher's Stones, but this is idiosyncratically Kunrath. And I'd suggest it's possibly related to the 3 principles of Paracelsus, the mercury, sulfur, and salt, that again, it's a threefold modality of the stone. And if you look at it, it's microcosmic, which is more the medieval transmutational alchemy of gold making, creating artificial stones and ever-burning light and so forth. The microcosmic level is more the Paracelsian spagyric chemiatrical level of healing body, spirit, and soul of man. The very claim that he says it can heal the soul of man doubtless gets him a huge amount of trouble from the church. You know, I mean, they are the ones who deal with souls, not alchemists, you know, but this is Kunrath's claim. And then he has a divine level of communicating with God. And that's unusual. It's connected with the Urim and Tumim of the Old Testament, the high priest Aaron. But also when you think of, I find it, when I think of Larry Principe's work on Robert Boyle and Boyle's interest in angels and collecting ideas about evidence of spirits or ghosts, it ties in with this, that alchemy has a higher dimension as well. Petrus Bonus in the 14th century suggests it as well. Okay. And then we get to the full-blown 1609 enlarged edition of the Amphitheater with its title as long-winded as me. I'm going to read it. The universal tertiary un, 3 times 3 in 1, Christian Kabbalist, divinely magical and physico-chemical Amphitheater of the only true eternal wisdom. No, physico-chemical. This is not, you know, spiritual-chemical or something. This is really, it's about matter. And then here, I would not recommend this book, The Modern English Word Formation and Neo-Latin Copulative Compounds, as a snappy bedtime read, but I do think it's a very good book. And the late Anna Granville-Hatcher, considered Kunrath's compound adjective physico-chymicus, unknown to classical Latin, to be the source of the English and international physico-chemical. This is our deeply dyed mystic, you know. And I don't know why they're always dabblers. I get so irritated by people. You know, anyone I like is called a dabbler. Heinrich Khunrath, the dabbler in Hermetic and Kabbalistic science, reputed in his time to have possessed the Philosopher's Stone, published at Hamburg in 1598, this book here, a Symbolum Physico-Chemicum de Cao Physico-Chemicorum Catholico. That's 1598. Now, she can be forgiven for not knowing that actually in 1595, 3 years earlier, his amphitheater also had Physico-Chemicum there. He's setting out his stall, if you like, already. And you know, it's okay, it's Kabbalistic, it's magic, but it's also physical-chemical. He's really dealing with the different levels of reality, celestial, celestial, terrestrial. Okay, and how does he define Physico-Chymia? In a not particularly spiritual way. The art of chemically dissolving, purifying, and rightly reuniting physical things by the method of nature. The universal, macrocosmically the philosopher's stone, microcosmically the parts of the human body. So there we've got transmutational and spagyric alchemy, and all the particulars of the inferior globe. Okay. If we look again at his portrait, we can see his library, a sort of indicative one, and we notice that Alchemia is the largest book. It's followed by Magia, both natural magic, astral magic, and ritual magic. I don't want to sort of give the impression that he's not interested in spirits or angels and things like that, and he does have what I would call a spiritual dimension, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily his alchemy. And then, ironically, medicine is, for any of his patients, they were probably perturbed to see that medicine is a lesser consideration in his life. The Bible is the substrate or the foundation to all of these. He is a theosopher. He's very devout in anything he does. And then at the top, you've got Historia. He's interested in accounts of the past, very cutely with an hourglass for the passing of time next door to it. Okay, and then if we look at the right-hand side, we get laboratory equipment. Practice in the laboratory, and also actually there's a rapier and a powder horn, so he was active in more ways than one. He dies at the age of 45, and none of us have any idea how he died, so I hope he wasn't a sticky end involved with something pointy, you know. Anyway, in the 1609 Amphitheater, he adds 5 hieroglyphical figures and then this rather grumpy owl on the right hand side. I'm using hand-colored ones. They're not normally like this, but it's just I'm a child and like these images. And what's interesting is we have the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, you know, the Urtext of alchemists. It's in Latin at the top, German underneath. And, you know, this is the technical Hermetic material that you also find discussed in the Tractatus Aureus, the golden treatise of Hermes Trismegistus with the 7 chapters there. But what is interesting is, underneath its foundation, just like the book is the foundation for his library and his portrait, we have the Pimander. And this, of course, is the philosophical Hermetica, translated by Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century from Greek. It includes the Asclepius, the famous text there, which had survived in Latin in the Middle Ages. And this text here is all about revelation. It's about how Hermes was feeling sleepy, and in that state, he was approached by the divine mind, Pimander, who asked him what he wanted to know. And he said, I want to know God and the nature of things. And in a moment of revelation, it was granted to him. This is where I think students of mine particularly start arguing, well, there must be a spiritual dimension then. And I would say there's a revelatory dimension that underpins his alchemical experience. And I wouldn't like to separate those. Kunrath explicitly criticizes those who separate the oratory, the place of prayer, from the laboratory. Okay, so we've got, very interesting, this is really rare, for someone to discuss the technical and the philosophical Hermetica. Basil Valentine does, and Michael Meyer does as well, but there aren't that many people who do really. This is his alchemical Citadel. And again, it's very down to earth. The orangey bits are 20 mistaken entrances to the Citadel. All of them are mistakes. All of them are fraudulent or erroneous. Sometimes it's just saying all that glitters is not gold. You know, don't be fooled by what you see. Others are you know, these are adulterated practices. And then there's one here about the homunculus, which is the practice of someone who's in despair to try and make a homunculus. So it's very interesting to see. This is a bit like his book on prematerial chaos. He's warning you, like other alchemists do, like Bernard Trevisan is famous for doing, and Albertus Magnus is famous for doing, saying, don't do these mistaken practices or be fooled by them. The one true practice is the one here, not colored in orange. You can see a sort of detail there. And basically, you encounter Hermes, presumably you're asked questions. If you answer them correctly, you're allowed across a drawbridge labeled Mysterion in Greek. You go through a gateway non omnibus, not for all. Above the gateway is, again, this sort of slightly modified Monas Hieroglyphica of John Dee inside two dragons. And then we have our Christian Kabbalist, alchemist, divine magician, kneeling, I had to say, not in front of Jesus, but in front of a baby dragon. And then I have to say, mummy or daddy is at the top. I'm being a bit silly there, sorry, but it's very interesting that he's got through his initiations, as it were, answered the questions and got to the center of the Citadel. This is another of the engravings. I call it the calumniators. Umberto Eco used to call it the nemici, the enemies. And it's, at first, you just see Beelzebub here, a very Roman Catholic looking cardinal, because Kunrath's a Lutheran, so this is enemy as well, and various demons and devils. But actually, if you look carefully, the center of this is called the Antrum Natura, the cave of nature, and it's surrounded by alchemical glyphs. And you might think, well, okay, why? It's actually interesting. If you look at the history of publishing, very few books have alchemical glyphs in them. Manuscripts, yes, but books, this is one of the first examples. And for me, these are easy to identify, but it's clear that one author of the Amphitheater has to make a table explaining them. And actually, I think he's got this one wrong. This, for me, is tartar, and Kunrath writes about tartar a lot. Stibium is antimony, which is used for extracting gold from ore, and it's normally a circle with the cross above it. But this one, Hellenitra, is good. Salpeter, this is vitriol, this is salt, this is sal ammoniac, and this Saturn one is actually Saturnine magnesia, which is curious. But nevertheless, these are identifiable chemical substances. This, for example, is cinnabar, you know. The point I'm trying to make is that this engraving is from the 1609 Amphitheater. In the 1595 one, we still have a hangover from the Middle Ages in that you get substances which are, they're not, you know, if you went into a shop and said, I'd like dew of heaven, you might not get it, or you might not get what you expect. Azoth, again, is okay. It's used still, but it's less clear what it is. Hule, of course, is the Greek for primal matter. Sanguis leonis, the blood of the lion. You get an interesting combination of medieval terminology, which is mysterious, and then other terminology like acetum acerrimum. It's vinegar, it's acetic acid. It's not mysterious at all. So you get a transition from what I would say is medieval nomenclature terminology to the later one where the symbols are, in some ways also, they are all glyphs. They transcend language. Whatever language you're from, you recognize what this glyph is. You don't need a translation. This made an impression on Michael Meyer, for example. In his book, The Swarm of Pseudo-Chemical Drones, Detected and Succinctly Refuted Thanks to the Lovers of Truth, not a succinct title, Kunrath is highly present here. Vladimir Karpenko, whom you may know, who's a chemist and historian of alchemy in Charles University Prague, has pleased me in that he confirmed in an article he wrote that Kunrath really knows his laboratory alchemy. And Michael Meyer is not plagiarizing him. He actually acknowledges Kunradius many times, but he's copying about 50 of Kunrath's warnings in this book and saying, you know, be careful about them. He adds a few more, but mostly it's Kunrath. This is where I'm hoping that some of you might actually help me a bit, because this is, I'm not great on technology like this. I'm not great with my computer either, but this is a close-up of the laboratory. And if you look at it, it's the oven unit is divided into 3 basic parts beneath the chimney flue. And I'm a bit stuck with this middle one. Now, I think, but this is a bit of a guess, that it's for cementation, which is given as a definition, dry corrosion, by which any metallic body is arranged in layers with corrosive salts and other desiccating substances, and consigned and broken up. Now, that is rather weakly based on comparing Pantheus, whom Kunrath has read, and Mylius, who has read Kunrath, a cementation furnace. But to be honest, I'm on dodgy ground with that. So if someone wants to smack me around the head, do. This one, though, I'm really pleased about. If you look at it on the left, it seems to be a distillation oven. I never really knew that this glass vessel was directly connected to the equipment. But here is a drawing from a manuscript attributed to Kunrath, and you can see what's going on. And with Destillier oven there. So this is distillation. And I'd say possibly this is the more spagyric side of Kunrath's work, his chemical medicine work. And then we look at the right-hand side, and I'd say this is more his gold-making work. It looks to be very much like a version of Lazarus Erker's assay furnaces, a testing or assaying furnace, an open furnace in which nobler metals are refined, examined, or fulminated. Now, I only thought Stephen Klucas fulminated, so I'm quite surprised that metals do as well. But anyway, I stand to be corrected, but I thought I'd have a go with this. Okay, this one I'm on safer ground. I really like this. And this is the point of my idiotic title of a not-so-lazy Henry. Henry, of course, is Heinrich Khunrath, but this is an Ethanol called a Furnus Acadiae, a furnace of sloth, which is me in the morning, or a Piga Henricus, lazy Henry. Because basically, in this central tower, you fill it up with coal or charcoal, and you can leave it to burn at the bottom and heat connected equipment. And what's happening here is, if it will move, okay, so the central column provides steady heat for a circular water-filled Balneum Mariae on the left. It holds a glass cucurbit containing anima, soul, with an alembic here, having a long spout through which condensed liquid flows to the receiver containing spiritus. So that's one side of the equipment. On the other side, it's possibly a furnus sabuli, a sand oven. On the right, labeled maturandum, it's got several flasks in it, one of which is resting on sands, the other possibly on ashes, to maintain heat at different temperatures. And this is fairly common. I mean, Libavius, who studied at University in Basel with Kunrath and absolutely detests him, I have to say. But Libavius is very useful for images of equipment, and this is one that basically is very similar to Kunrath's. What is nice is in another manuscript in Kunrath's name, we find explanations or intimations of why he's using it, because the amphitheater explains nothing. So the left-hand square here, oven, is for dissolution of substances, while the circular bain-marie is for separation of spirit and soul from the body and its mortification. For death is the separation of the soul from the body. So it's quite interesting. You have to, I mean, Geber is famous for his discussion of dispersa intentio, this idea that you scatter your knowledge through different works. And I would say to a certain extent, this is what Kunrath's doing. He's publishing, he's giving you his calling card, and for me, a very attractive calling card with all the engravings, but you still need other manuscripts to give you a sense of what's going on. Okay, I've not too much more. Okay, so the final bit is literally about his invention, the technology of the Ethanol. First published in 1599, but this is the 1603 edition, and there we have his Ethanol. And I'm just going to give you just some sense of his descriptions. This is taken from him. It has a transparent glass lid to enable the alchemist to examine the materials without opening the oven, together with the glass base, so as to be able to check the wick. Okay. He has designed a new kind of wick, which rather than being made of fast-burning rushes, cotton or silk, is incombustible, made either of gold or asbestos, and can be adjusted by raising or lowering a convenient ring to regulate the height of the flame. He's incredibly proud of this. It has a spherical lamp. You can't see this, but there's another engraving I'll show you, made of glass so that the alchemist can check the level of whatever kind of fuel he's using. And he lists tallow, oil, wax, butter, fat. The ethanol can be set up so that with 2, 3, or 4 ducts, it can heat a similar number of ovens. Or conversely, one oven can be heated by 4 such lamps or lateral reservoirs, and it can be safely placed on a table or bench, even used in the bedroom, without risk of smoke, damp, fumes, and probably romance or wife. I mean, the fact that she's doing this in his bedroom suggests that maybe Heinrich is single, but maybe I'm wrong about that. In this lovely painting from the British Museum, Tables of Kabbalistic Theosophy, there's a detail of his Ethanol, and this is what he means by his reservoirs. And I found it very interesting. So you could have up to 4 of these surrounding and each sending fuel to it, or you could have one reservoir and then other ducts going off to heat different bits of equipment. So quite fascinating, you know, he really, and you can see how it really is transparent. I mean, you can see inside. Now, Johann Daniel Mylius was clearly impressed by this. This is from his medical chemical works, and it's several volumes. The Basilica Philosophica has lots of alchemical imagery, laboratory work. And there on one page, I've sort of separated out, this is Kunrath's Ethanol. And it's not just me being wishful. He actually has quite a long page describing in nauseating detail, it's quite hard to translate the Latin, deep bits of the equipment. I'd love someone, if someone has got metalworking skills, I'd love someone to make this. I'd love to see a copy of it, but that's wishful thinking. Mylius isn't the only person. Theophilus Schweighardt, early Rosicrucian respondent, who's Daniel Mergling, court physician, astronomer, and mathematician to Landgrave Philipp von Hessen-Butzbach. In his Speculum Sophicum Rodus Eroticum, we know it's a Kunrath influence. It's got aura and labora here, but more importantly, it has this engraving, which, if you remember Kunrath's Oratory-Laboratory, the Oratory-Laboratory are on the same level. And I think he gets into trouble for that. And Schweighardt instead, or Mergling, has it different. He has a hierarchical, prayer is the primary work, the ergon, and then laboratory work is the secondary work. And just in case you wondered, yes, most people say, this is borrowed from there. Years ago, I suspected that this was influenced by Kunrath's Ethanol. It's not identical, but it's very close. And lo and behold, the very generous Vera Keller gave me this letter to Isaac Habrecht, so professor of astronomy and mathematics at Strasbourg, also compiler of the 5th volume of the Theatrum Chemicum. And it's a letter where he praises Kunrath, and he even draws a deconstructed, disassembled version of Kunrath's Ethanol, which I find remarkable. Mergling is really interested in technology. He's interested in many things, including perpetual motion. But it's very interesting to see, you know, sorry, John Reed, but our mystic easily dismissed as nothing to do with laboratory alchemy, who's clearly being taken seriously. And now, just to ruin my own argument, I love this copy of Kunrath that reminds me of Tintin from when I was a kid for some reason. It's a rather comic book style, but it's a lovely engraving in Copenhagen from a relation of Johann Valentin Andreae. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Should I stop share? Or maybe not.
So if you could stop share, please. Thank you, Pete. That was absolutely wonderful. And I'm sure.
Sorry.
Well, don't worry. I'm sure we will live. This is, as you can imagine, this is all way out of my comfort zone. So can I ask a fairly generic question, as using my chair's prerogative while people put questions into the or say they want to ask questions in the chat box. Look at those images. They look expensively produced, very well executed, very well engraved, very well printed, which suggests that there's a sort of, is there a sort of big market for these kind of books? How much would one of his books sell for? How many copies would be printed? Or is that just asking for too much information at this time?
To be honest, it's a really good question, but it's not one I can answer, Frank. I do know that the first edition, the 1595 one, is large and expensive. It's adorned, not every copy, but certain copies, like in Vienna, have got gold paint and silver on them. It must have been very expensive. And the speculation is that it was a very small print run of about 5 or 6 copies. at least we only know of 5, that were intended maybe for Kunrath's patron. He had been at the court of Rudolf II. His patron until 1592 was Rudolf II's second in command, Wilhelm Rosenberg, who was sort of the controller, as it were, of South Bohemia. So possibly one of them maybe have gone to Rudolf himself, possibly the copy in Vienna, which is one of the most opulent ones, because Kunrath's books all have imperial privilege for 10 years. So it could have been a sort of thank you gift there. We do know that Johann Arndt, the famous pietist theologian, whose work was some of the most popular Lutheran works ever, also is a friend of Kunrath and writes the first ever book review of the 1595 Amphitheater, so he may have had one. I found one engraving, a solitary engraving in Texas at a university there, so maybe there were other copies, but we only know of 5 full copies. The 1609 one is specifically in a smaller version of a folio, where the publisher acknowledges that it's because the other one was so expensive and so unavailable that they have made it less costly. It's all printed in black and white there. I've just luckily found some color versions that I find particularly attractive, but those must have been commissioned to be colored by the owner after they'd purchased. I doubt that they were colored beforehand. The 1595 ones, though, were colored beforehand, except one copy which has never been colored. But the price, no idea at all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, questions are coming in thick and fast. So so Alexander Angerhofer first, please, if you unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful talk. So I was wondering, what is the significance of these musical instruments in the Oratorium-Laboratorium?
Oh, you mean on the table?
Yes.
Okay, that's a really nice question, and I wish I had the picture in front of me now to tell you. Basically that table in the center, I mean, I argue in my book that if the oratory is the realm of the divine, of God and the angels, and the laboratory is the realm of matter, then the table really represents man as the go-between those two territories, those realms. And if you look at the table carefully, the right-hand side of the table is more to do with investigation of matter. So there are weighing scales, there are knives and things like that for chopping up matter. There's a magnifying glass for actually closely examining whatever's in the flask. The left-hand side of the table is more to do with the oratory. So it's got writing materials, it's got musical staves, it's got a bell which maybe is used in religious practices. And then it's got these 4 musical instruments which mystify me, if I'm honest. I argue that 2 of them are more for popular music, as it were, whereas 2 are more for devotional music. But to be honest, I'm not hugely convincing about that because I'm not a musicologist. And I've asked musicologists and they're not quite sure themselves. But it's a good question. I mean, do you have any interpretations?
I do not. I was just curious. But thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah, pleasure.
Okay. Jolie, if I pronounce that correctly, Shackleford, next.
Oh, Jolie, hi. Wow.
Hi, yes, I stopped on my way to the History of Science Society meeting so I could tune in.
Pleasure. Nice to see you. It's been years.
Yeah, maybe I've missed it in your presentation, but do you think Dee got the Monas from Kunrath or the other way around?
No, I think Kunrath got it from Dee. I mean, the Monas was published 1564 and Kunrath was only born in 1560. So he'd been very precocious. But it's interesting. It's a good question, though, because I've forgotten the name. Oh dear, a French scholar who's written about Rosicrucianism suggests that actually the Monas appears in the Chemical Wedding, which is published in 1616, the Rosicrucian novella. And
would this be Didier Kahn?
No, it's not Didier. I definitely remember, but this is another. Stefan. No, I honestly can't remember. But anyway, that French historian argues that actually, possibly the Rosicrucians got their Monas in the Rosicrucian Chemical Wedding from Kunrath rather from Dee. I'm not sure if I totally agree with that, but certainly Johann Valentin Andreae is really horribly snotty about Kunrath. So maybe he, uses but disapproves of.
Well, thank you.
But definitely, yeah. I mean, we know from Dee's sort of patchy diary that Kunrath came to visit him in Bremen in 1589 when Dee was on the way home back to England. And he said the famous Dr. Kunrath, I don't think Kunrath was very famous, to be honest. I mean, he'd only graduated from university the year before. But anyway, a very genteel way of saying this German guy came to visit me. But it's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Stephen Klukas next.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for that paper, Pete. It was wonderful. I particularly liked your introduction of the Ethanol and the deconstruction. It was really very interesting. I wanted to ask about one particular thing. I was fascinated by these different substances: tallow, oil, wax, butter, and fat. And I just wondered if Kunrath discusses the different kinds of fire or heat that you get from these different substances in the other work that you mentioned. Isn't it the fire?
The De Igne Mogrorum, yeah. To be honest, Stephen, he doesn't, which is a shame. He does discuss the use of various types of wood, but again, he's rather unforthcoming. I mean, what I've tried to look for, actually, and never been successful, is people discussing the sort of different heats and why you would use one type of wood instead of another wood. Now, it's just, I live in Amsterdam, so if I set anything on fire, I'd burn down the city, probably. But I'd love to know about, you know, when do you use juniper, when do you use oak or pine or whenever. Some must be hot burning, others are long burning, but sadly he doesn't go into details. And it's the same with the tallow and the fat and the other things. What's interesting though, of course, is that all of those will fit inside the receptacle, and you don't have to have an external fire heating everything and risking setting your bedroom and your beloved on fire, you know.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that elaboration of Kunrath's laboratory equipment. It was fascinating. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I hope he was, but also I hope he was correct. I'm not convinced by the central one, and I hope someone will correct me, you know, or reassure me.
Okay, Mike Zuber next.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Pete. Thanks so much for this talk. It's been a little while. And as you know, I've heard you give lots of talks about Kunrath over the space.
Too many, I think, is the honest
many
truth.
years. I think the first one I heard in 2011. And I was just fascinated to see these manuscripts that are attributed to Kunrath, and that you showed us these beautiful pages or illustrations from them, but you didn't really go into detail about them. So could you please fill us in? What are these manuscripts? Where are they?
No,
are they genuine?
To be honest, Mike, I'm being cagey. I told Frank beforehand that I've actually not given details. It sounds a bit pathetic, but basically 3 Czech guys whom I really admire, Karpenko, Prush, and Zemler, are writing a book about Kunrath, and they are writing it right now. And they are trying to get it to another, I'm getting published by Brill, but this is another publication series in Brill. And that's why I'm being really cagey, because I found these are my babies. I want to get my book out and published before someone else steals my thunder. As it is, you know, I know these guys, I really rate them, but they do have my PhD. So I already feel as though some of my thunder's potentially being taken, you know. So that's why that's why I'm being very, you know, holding my cards close to my chest. If you really want, I can send you the details.
Okay, fair enough.
But I'd rather not.
About these different kinds of wood, I just came across this. Well, not just. It's a little while now. Different kinds of woods that you use to create different kinds of charcoal, again, to have different kinds of temperatures.
Yeah, exactly.
And that kind of stuff. So maybe we should compare notes again sometime.
Thanks
a lot
like
for your
that.
talk.
Yeah, I'd really like that. Is this in book or manuscript?
That's in manuscript. I mean, my work, or you mean my work or the source?
Yeah, your source.
The sources, actually, some of it is in being Gucci's Pyrotechnia.
Okay. You know, I haven't read that for years, and I should do. That's really sensible.
Yeah. So that's
thanks. But yeah, we'll be in touch. If you don't know Mike, he wrote a very good book on spiritual alchemy as his PhD, supervised by me, a student transcending teacher by far. And every time I said it's not spiritual here, I kept looking guiltily at him. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you for that insight into your supervisory role. So next question is from Sergei Zotov.
Okay. I can see bottom left-hand corner. Hello, Sergei. Invisible at the moment. Oh, should I just, he's not speaking, but I can see this message in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you, Pete. Can I ask you why the manuscript from the British Library you mentioned has mirrors implemented into images? Oh, that's a good question. And I resist mentioning it, Sergei. I would totally, basically, okay, I showed you that painting from the British Library, and it's concealed in the inside front cover of a manuscript. But the manuscript really is, I can't really show you. Do you mind if I just quickly go back into share screen?
No.
Okay. If you, and apologies if you suffer from epilepsy. Oh yeah, no, here it is. Oh, come on. Of course it slows down when you want it to speed. No. Oh, okay. Ay. Sorry, Mr. Impatient here. Good. If we look at this first image, Kunrath is kneeling in front of two images. This, I would say, is the Sloane 181 manuscript, because when you open it, on the left-hand side is the image of Christ cruciform, and on the right-hand side is Adam Androgyne. But as Sergei mentions, these are gilded onto mirrors. And it's quite fascinating that when you look in the one on the left, you see Christ superimposed on you. You look in the one on the right, you see Adam Androgyne. And I would definitely say that these are, I've written in my book a bit about magical mirrors, that these are definitely theosophical. He calls them his theosophical, Kabbalistic theosophical tables. And they are definitely...
Can you turn off?
I don't know if that's a question or whether it was just ectoplasm or something.
Hopefully it's been muted.
Okay, but anyway, so yes, I would say they are divinely magical. It's for knowing yourself. It's the first Adam and the new Adam, the reborn Adam, Christ. And I find it interesting that when the manuscript is closed, the two of them are face to face, as it were, conjoined together. So yes, Sergei, I would say it's nothing to do with alchemy, unless you want to say spiritual alchemy, but that's so poorly defined, apart from by Mike Zuber, of course. But anyway, I hope that answers your question a bit.
Okay, so the next question is from YouTube without a name. So the question is, does Kunrath use the word Catholic in any specific sense, and referring specifically to the Amphitheater text?
Yeah, and he uses this term all the time. I translate it generally as universal. I sometimes keep in Catholic. I don't think it's Roman Catholic. I mean, he's a Lutheran. He's a rather unorthodox Lutheran. But at the same time, Wilhelm Rosenberg, his patron for a few years, was Catholic. He was a very open-minded Catholic, though, in that he had a sequence of Protestant wives, not a harem of Protestant wives, but he had a sequence of them. And unless he was bumping them off, he clearly, had a sort of open-minded approach. Kunrath was Protestant. Other people who were working there in the court as alchemists also had Protestant or even heretical credentials to them. But then John Dee was there, and John Dee is generally considered Catholic. So I think Kunrath in there is being slightly ironic, slightly has an eye in the direction of his patron and employer, but also is just, he has a penchant for Greek terms. When he writes Mageia, he tends to write it in the Greek way. And I think he likes Catholicus for similar reasons, that he uses it in Greek. I think it's one way of him sort of tuning into antiquity, as it were, in a way, rather than just being purely modern. But,
okay. The next is from John Christie, who has mysteriously written a question on chaos and prime matter. John.
Ooh.
I very much enjoyed your emphasis on the physico-chemical.
Good.
Could you just talk us a bit through how you get from chaos and prime matter through to, say, salt, sulfur, and mercury, and tallow and butter, and so forth? Does Kunrath take you through that?
Kunrath is, if I'm honest, a pain in the posterior. Let me just find the diagram I want. So Kunrath very rarely explains anything, John, in his published works. So it can be infuriating. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, if you look at the sphere here, which is the Philosopher's Stone, can you see on the left you've got chaos in Greek,
Yes.
then you've got materia prima, then
Yes.
you've got magnesia, and then you've got lapis. And basically, he has one book on chaos, which he says is a type of primal matter. He has another book on magnesia, which he says is also a type of primal matter. But they're modalities of matter. One of these is watery. One of these seems to be more solid, as though it's sort of it's gone from a liquid state to a solid state. But both of them still constitute in some way a form of primal matter before the lapis is the ultimate matter. If you look here, though, the chaos is with air, which makes sense. I mean, in natural philosophy, you know, it's air, it's no specific shape or form. Magnesia here is watery magnesia, which he translates, he glosses as magnesia, the magnet of God, of Yah, showing his Rastafarian credentials probably. But anyway, he's very interested in discussing this primal matter, but in different states. And I think he's influenced by the modalities of Paracelsus in that. But at the same time, he never explicitly just sits and explains it. I've got a chapter, well, I've got several chapters in the book, which is now being, Stephen knows, is called The Bloody Book. But The Bloody Book is almost been set off. And I try and unpack these various terms for primal matter, but sometimes it's a bit tentative because he's not very good on, as a teacher, is dreadful. You know, I mean, he just does not explain things. But anyway, I mean, even this, if you look at the center of it, you've got this glyph. Now you've got here hule. Everyone thinks that's highly, is Yah, but it's not. It's hule, it's the Greek primal matter. And then it's got this squiggle. And I sort of abuse this squiggle by getting students or people at conferences to say what it is. And you get it split. Half people say it's a serpent, and half people say it's the zodiac sign for Leo. And I point out that if it's a serpent, it's watery Mercury, and if it's fiery Leo, it's fiery sulfur. So there's an oscillation between Mercury and sulfur. Yes. I mean, of course, that's messed up when you get this green serpent, but still, he doesn't explain. You know, you get one French guy in the 17th century speculating what it is. But it's, and you get quite a few people analyzing different parts of these engravings, but some things are just still a mystery, you know.
Well, anyway, that's very, very helpful indeed, Pete. Thanks a lot. No, that really has helped. Thanks.
Sure, pleasure.
Okay, and one last question from YouTube, from Corey Andrews.
Corey, hi.
Asking, could you say something about what Kunrath makes of the Rosicrucian manifestos?
Kunrath doesn't make anything of them because he's dead. He dies in 1605 and the manifestos are published 1614, 15, 16. So, Corey, you and I would have to try necromancy to find out what he says. He probably doesn't like the first two because they're very snippy about him. The Confessio, 1615, is really horrible about an amphitheatral comedian. And that can only be Kunrath, who does crack awful jokes, I have to say. So he probably isn't very fond of it. But at the same time, if you think of the Chemical Wedding, there's a lot of shared material that you could see between the Rosicrucians and Kunrath. Johann Valentin Andreae, who's often described as the author, the putative author of the Chemical Wedding and the earlier manifestos, seems to have developed a loathing for Kunrath. But I mentioned to you Theophilus Schweighardt, who writes the letter to Habrecht and deconstructs the... Now, I think he's classed as a sort of cousin of Andreae, and he's very pro-Kunrath. So very early on, there seems to have been a split between lovers and haters. And you do get very others who are interested in Rosicrucianism. Johannes Boreas, for example, in Sweden, who's the tutor to the king of Sweden and his kids. He's pro Kunrath. So you get, you know, some who like him and some who really don't.
So having suggested that might be the last question, 3 more questions have suddenly popped up. So if people are happy to carry on for a bit longer,
I'm okay.
Feel free to disappear if you want to. So JV Fields first.
Hello, Judith.
Hello, Peter.
Nice to hear you.
Yes. I wondered if you had a clue who did the drawings for him.
Ooh.
The use of perspective
Yeah.
is very much the sort of old-fashioned, look at this for a bit of construction. And
Yeah.
on the whole, in works a bit earlier than this, that's used to indicate a scene is happening here below, as opposed to great spiritual above. So, for instance, in an altarpiece, it will be the Annunciation that is shown in acute perspective, whereas everything else will be shown with much less concern for perspective.
Really? Thank you, Judith. I really didn't know that.
I wonder who did the drawings for him.
Okay.
It's not a hard and fast tradition, but you get examples of it, and it's probably part of the commission.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It's very
Okay.
noticeable that in Giotto, I mean, as early as that,
Yeah.
the accurate perspective is in the Annunciation scenes in the in the Arena Chapel. I mean, that's 1310.
Oh, thanks. Oh,
Right
you've just given me a very busy. I'm teaching tomorrow, but in the afternoon I'll be reading up on this. Anyway, the most of the engravings are by someone called Peter or Paulus von der Dort, who is at one stage based in Antwerp. Not much is known about him. He's known for engraving a scene of Berlin and of 1 or 2 religious imageries, in the Holy Family, for example. But the deep perspective engraving is by someone famous. It's Hans Friedemann de Vries.
Oh, good Lord, yes.
I mean, he's pretty well known. He wrote a very good book on perspective in 1604. Well, he drew a very good book on perspective in 1604, which I'd dearly love to have. One sold in auction yesterday for €700, but I'm so broke I couldn't buy it. But it's de Vries, and de Vries was also at the court of Rudolf doing work there. Earlier in his career, he actually worked with Bruegel? Yeah.
So they actually went to an expert on perspective in order to get that particular panel done. So the use of perspective is absolutely deliberate.
Yes, I mean, I know I'm sticking my neck out a bit, but I really do think that the first 3 two-dimensional images in the book are the implication is that the alchemy, the magic Cabala on their own is not enough, and that this Oratory-Laboratory is deeply 3-dimensional because it's all of them combined. But I also like that is what's happening here below is a really nice idea. It is. But yeah, de Vries does a lot of incredibly deep perspective engravings. I found one where he's actually drawn a body on a table, which made me think of
yes, it's Hans Baldung Green. It's a well-known trick.
Yeah, but it reminded me when Alexander earlier asked about the question of the objects on the table, and if you look at de Vries's image of this body on the table in perspective, it almost looks like the precursor for Kunrath's engraving, to be honest. Although I can't say that because the book was published 1604.
Musical instruments are, of course, a traditional thing to draw in perspective as well.
Yeah. But thanks for the question. That's nice. It is.
Okay. Next question is very straightforward. Tony G from YouTube would like to know the title of your book and when it will be published.
Oh, the book. Yeah, the book has meant to have been published for, I think, several centuries now. But anyway, when Stephen started supervising me in my PhD years ago, he was just fresh from the egg. Look at him now. Wow. Venerable. Okay, wise old man. But anyway, Yeah, the book, I'm meant to be sending it off. Basically, all I'm doing is I'm waiting for copyright permission for images because there are so many images, and I'm waiting for a few more images to arrive from various places because I've only got either low quality images or I want color versions of some images. And as soon as those arrive, they're going in, and then I'm sending it off to Brill. So that could be the end of the month if I'm lucky, but it takes some archives. I mean, I had to wait for 10 weeks to get an image from Yale because they are so backed up. They don't have enough people working there because of COVID and so forth. So basically, ideally, it's going to be November. It might be December. Once it gets to Brill, they have to set it up, and then they send it back to me as proofs. I have to check 2 volumes, God help me. And I've also got to create a very detailed index. The anonymous readers said it really needs a good index. So the idea is it's not going to be a stocking filler at Christmas. You need pretty big stockings, but instead it's going to be early next year. Brill are pretty efficient. Once they get working, it gets done.
Okay, let's try and make this the last question from John Tresh.
Yes, thanks very much. This is fantastic material, and I can't wait to see the book.
Thanks.
I've really enjoyed the discussion. You went in such detail to demonstrate that Kunrath is very involved in working with matter, in technology, the processes, the understanding of the elements. And that's interesting and very revealing. Do you have ways of going into similar detail on his spiritual techniques, or is he more evasive on these questions? We know about prayer, we know about the magic mirrors. Do you have any sense of other methods he uses? And is there any sense of an equivalence between those kinds of technologies?
To be honest, that's a really good question. I focused on the alchemy here because it's for Shack. The history of alchemy chemistry, but to be honest, in that I am not being faithful to Kunrath, who says you can't separate them. But at the same time, he is in his engraving kneeling in his oratory. He's not standing in his laboratory. So he's looking at the engraving, which has got, I presume, mirrors in it. And I always find that quite interesting. Is he looking? Can he see us through the mirror looking in at his room? I always like sort of imagining that. But the reality is, Kunrath, unfortunately, is low on explanations. You have to speculate a lot, which is why the book's taken me so long, because I have to read so much other material. I go and look for what he's read, and he does give you some fairly explicit sense of whom he admires. For example, on Theosophy, it's Valentin Weigel, the nonconformist theologian, and it's Johann Arndt. He's also very fond of Agrippa, and not just the obvious 3 books of occult philosophy, but other works as well. He's very, very influenced by Johannes Reuchlin, the first major Christian Kabbalist. And he also is aware of Pico della Mirandola. So all I've done, basically the book has chapters on alchemy, on magic and Kabbalah, on theosophy, where I obsessively engage with different aspects. To give you an example, the alchemy chapter is about 210 pages. Magic one is similar. They're each the equivalent of an Oxford publication, basically. But on techniques, it's all sort of implicit rather than explicit. I do describe, and I have to say, for this, I'm indebted to Harry Wood Tilton. Harry Wood Tilton wrote a very, very good book on Kunrath, article on Kunrath's manuscript on the fashioning of magical armor. And then he really generously shared the manuscripts that he'd found, and I obsessed about it. I've extra things to say, but I am indebted to Harry Wood. And if you're interested, I would say go to academia.edu and download his article. But it's very good because he gives you some sense of, he's working with matter, he's making magical armor. It's electrum, which is in theory a combination of 7 metals, like the 7 planets. But he also gives you magical spells, if you like, martial sayings that you don't just, you shout or scream in a martial way. It's a bit like method acting onto the armor. And at the same time, you strike it with the glyph of Mars that you find in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy in the 2nd book. So you've got to be emotionally in a martial mood. You've got to say martial verses, not the poet Martial, but stuff with martial symbolism. You've got to strike in the glyph, and you've got to work with Electrum Magicum, this Electrum that Paracelsus gives you the recipe for. There is a woman who's actually doing really good work on Electrum at the moment, but she said that Electrum turns out to be very brittle. So I'm not quite sure whether Electrum armor, however expensive it is, would be successful. But my long-winded way of answering your question is that you get some sense of there's a verbal magic there. This is in Latin, but also the first image, he's using divine names in Hebrew, and he really does use that phrase that you come across: do not translate the barbarous words. You don't translate them into English or into German. It's like translating Omne Padme Hum, the Buddhist compassion mantra, into Om, jewel in the lotus, because it just, makes it nonsensical in a way. You know what it means, but it loses its power. So Kunrath is, when I said he liked using Greek terminology, sometimes he likes using Hebrew because he feels these are original power words. But he doesn't explain what he does with them. So then you have to speculate on, he's reading Tritemius, he's influenced by the abbot Tritemius, he's influenced by the Christian Kabbalists, and you have to extrapolate from there, really.
Great, thank you.
Oh, you're the one with that Arabic image, are you? That's interesting. Okay.
Okay, so I think on that note, I will draw the discussion to a close. Just to say that the next seminar in this series will be held on the 19th of January, further details nearer the time. And to thank everybody who's involved in producing these seminars. It's quite extraordinary how many people are actually involved in one way or another. So it's Rob Johnson, Anna Simmons, Caroline Cobble, Becky Martin, Chris Campbell, and Joe Hedison. And it just remains for me to thank Pete Shaw for giving us absolutely wonderful seminar and provoking such an excellent discussion. So thank you, Pete.
Sure, pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Great.
Have a good evening, everybody, whether if you're in Europe, or good afternoon if you're in the United States.
Yeah, I've got to go and start preparing for my class tomorrow morning now. Oh dear. But first, some dinner. Take care, everyone. Good to see you.